will make Laurie feel more at home with a little inclemency around, whatever. So I've been given the wonderful opportunity to welcome you all and say a few words of introduction about Laurie. She's been doing these blog posts where she was talking about proudly walking around her yard with her canoe over her head as a way to get ready for a portage, which it turns out wasn't quite the same thing. She also, when she was starting to do it, she would come over to our place on Bisky Pond and paddle around a bit, and she thought she'd try her new tent. So she did. She went out and paddled around and dragged it up and put it up in our backyard and realized that the bugs were a little ferocious. So this camping expedition turned out to some wine on the porch. Like your kids coming in from the rain and then you're sent back out again. Anyway, we've been part of this for forever, I think, and it's gone by in a blink, but it's very exciting to see it come to this point. And I just started reading her book and want to finish it now because it's really great. So I hope everybody has a chance to do that if you haven't already. And with that, let's welcome Laurie Chandler, Laurie Apgar Chandler.
Thank you very much, Bill. I still remember also the first time I was out trying the wheels with my kayak, and you came by and took a picture of me. It was just right by the O'Briens, and the sheep were in the background. I just love that picture. But thank you all for coming this afternoon. This means so much to me to have come to this moment, and also to look out and just see the faces of each individual person that's here today. There are so many of you that played a part in my journey as a paddler and a person and a writer, and I just can't believe we've gotten here to this point. I think it's probably appropriate to start by thanking a few people. So I will definitely start by thanking Canoe Library. I'm going to call Pam up here. And I have to tell you that when we moved to this community in 2003, which was my two children who were then in 3rd and 6th grade, and we moved in the middle of a cold January, and we received a warm welcome in Canoe, and one of the first things we did was to volunteer to come in and work on Thursday nights. And our children's librarian here was always so creative in finding things that my children could do to be useful, and I helped process the new books. So this was really one of my first homes here in Damerscott, and I want to read what I wrote in this book that I am very proud to have in the Canoe collection. It's short, but it says it all in one sentence. To Canoe, the library at the heart of our community. With warm thanks, Laurie Apgar Chandler, October 29th, 2017.
Thank you very much.
Pam.
Thank you. Now that you're finished with the trip, can you come back and volunteer again?
I would like that. I would. The next thing on our agenda, I'm going to be signing. I've already been signing, and I'm going to be signing some more, but you all have a chance to sign as well. I don't know how many of you know Taylor Briggs, but I'm sure many people in this room do. Taylor and Rem are an important part of the Canoe family, and they're adventurers like I am. As a matter of fact, I was here not long ago to hear Rem talk about their Appalachian Trail through hike, and Taylor substitutes at Great Salt Bay School, where I work during the day in special ed, and she was in a bicycle accident just a little over a week ago, a very serious accident. I went off last weekend to do a similar talk to this, not even knowing if she was going to make it. And she's such a strong person that she is now home. She came home Friday night, but I had bought her one of these cards, and certainly still appropriate because she has a recovery ahead of her. So we're all going to sign this, and then we'll send a copy of the book to her. So it's going to be outside as you go out towards the refreshments on the right. There's a little table there, and I would appreciate if everybody could send a message to her. All right, what is next on here? I'm not going to use notes after the beginning, but it helps to get started with some notes so I don't forget my thanks. So the only other people that I really wanted to mention that couldn't be here today are my parents. And they are just, have been tied up in this whole process of who I've become as an adventurer, and they've lived through this process of turning my paddle into a book. And they already had plans for this weekend to go to the Canadian National Power Squadron Conference, which my dad is very involved in. And when we had to reschedule the book launch until today, they were not able to be here. But I would really be remiss if I didn't say what a role they had played. My dad actually paddled with me for the first week and the last day of the trip, and they were my resupply team. Why is nothing advancing? There we go. So one of the first questions that I get is, why did I want to do what I did as far as my adventure and the writing? And in a minute I'm going to tell you about the trip in some detail, but I thought I would start with the why piece. And I apologize, it's a little bit of a fuzzy photo, but it was too cool to resist showing you. This is my great-grandfather. I knew him as Grampy, and I was actually blessed to know 5 of my great-grandparents and all 4 of my grandparents well into my life. And so I remember him very well. He was a professional photographer, and he was just in love with the islands off the coast of New Jersey. So this is Island Beach, and he spent many, many years photographing the beach, and his work has been included in a couple of books about the region. And so I think not only him, but several of my other ancestors were also people that like to get out in nature or to go to remote places, and sometimes to do it alone. So I think I come by it in that way, honestly. And I think it was pretty evident from my earliest years that I loved being outside. I loved fishing and hiking. And we grew up camping, but it was tent camping, and then after a while we got a little pop-up trailer. We didn't really do all that much paddling, but we were always outside, and my parents gave me the gift of time together. We spent our weekends together as a family, and they took us to places. They were lifelong learners, and they encouraged us to be people that were always interested in history and natural history of the places that we visited. So there I am fishing on the left, and they had the cutest story they tell from one of our early camping trips. I wanted to go fishing, and I was 3, and so they just took a pin and they bent it into a little hook, and they tied it to a string and tied the string to a stick, and they said I sat there for hours, like literally 4 or 5 hours, just holding my stick and waiting for a fish to come. And then when I was a teenager, I used to go fishing for real. We had a reservoir near our house that was stocked with trout, so I would do that or go off hiking. And I mean, I also had friends and a busy social life, but I just always enjoyed being out by myself, and I always get the question, aren't you scared to do solo trips? And I just am lucky that it doesn't really scare me. And so then we go on to my career. I went to school to be a forester, and I was at Duke University getting my master's degree when I took a class at NC State on forest genetics, and I just fell in love with doing that. So I did sort of this little specialized niche of forestry, and we were breeding trees to make them grow faster and be straighter, and it kept me outside all the time, and I really loved it. So I did that for 15 years until we moved up here. And the other reason that I wanted to do this and why I wanted to turn my adventure into a book is just the fascination that I've always had with words and the power of words. And this is something that they call it a Wordle. Usually you do it in a program called Wordle, and I actually used a program called Word It Out to create this. But you put in words that are important to you, and it generates this little graphic. So those are some of the words that were at the heart of my canoe trip. And when I think about some of the people that influenced me and inspired me and whose work is incorporated into Upwards, some of those are people that I only knew through the written word. And this gentleman on the top right, his name is Henry Withy, and he was an attorney from Rockland, Maine, who went on a trip down the Allagash. He went the length of Moosehead Lake on one of the steamers, and then he went by canoe from there to Fort Kent. So he did roughly the last 200 and some miles of the Northern Forest Canoe Trail. And he wrote a journal about it that I discovered on the Maine Historical Society's online website. And, you know, I just try to think about how many people might have read that journal, and it's probably not really very many. It's the kind of thing that you just discover. And yet he put his words out there. He published the journal, and it was sitting there waiting for me to discover it, read it, and have it influence my decision to go on this trip. And of course, there were a lot of other people that helped me. The top left, that's me with Gil Gilpatrick, who wrote a book on the Allagash that we read when we were first starting to think about paddling. So he was sort of this legend to me. And then I went to the Maine Canoe Symposium and I met him, and he encouraged me to take the trip, and since he's a writer, he then encouraged me to write about it. The people on the bottom right are all thru-paddlers of the Northern Forest Canoe Trail, and I met them when I was in this particular group when I went to a Freshet Fest, they called it, in Burlington, Vermont. And at that time, I only really knew Bettina Danan. This is Bettina here, and she is probably the person other than my parents that I'm most indebted to for having gotten to the point that I'm at now, because she wrote the Thru-Paddler's Companion, which is sort of the Bible for people that want to do all of the Northern Forest Canoe Trail. And she also sent me countless emails. She would just all of a sudden in the afternoon think of something that she thought I needed to know about a certain section of river, and she would sit down and write like a 4-paragraph email to me giving me advice and her thoughts on it. And then the third gentleman from the left is Dan Brown, and the one all the way on the right is Peter McFarland. I was meeting them both for the first time at this event, and they volunteered to paddle on Lake Champlain with me, just like that. And so anyway, wonderful people and a wonderful community. So this is the trail. It is the longest mapped inland paddling trail in the country, and it goes from Old Forge, New York in the Adirondacks to Fort Kent, which is right on the Canadian border in northern Maine. It crosses 4 states and 1 province. And I tried to think, I've done other talks that are a lot longer where I just focus on the trail, but I wanted to at least give you a sort of overview of what the trail is to me. So it's composed of historic waterways that were once the highways for the native peoples. In New York it would have been the Iroquois, and in the rest of the states it would have been the Wabanaki. And then, of course, those highways became the routes that the settlers and the loggers and early naturalists would have used. But there isn't any one single waterway, so they're connected by portages. Every time that a river goes from one watershed to the other, you have to cross over the height of land. And the route itself was researched by 3 gentlemen, and we're lucky enough to have one of them in the room here, and that is Mike Krepner, and I still haven't met him. Where's Mike? Right back there. So his name is in my book, but it's just an honor to be able to meet him today, and he can correct me if I get the story wrong, but I believe back in the 1990s there were 3 friends who were interested in making sure that these native waterways didn't get lost, and to research them. And from what I understand, to go out and bushwhack their way across a number of them. And so they came up with the idea for the trail. And then two other people, Kay Henry and Rob Center, were very instrumental in taking that information and then getting the funding and doing the on-the-ground work to actually start to put the trail in place. And I put that second bullet point up there because when you do a long trip like this, it isn't just the waterways, it's also all the land that you cross. And when you go all the way across New England like that, there are just so many diverse landscapes. And there's a lot of joy to be gotten from crossing from one different type of landscape to another. After you've been doing agricultural communities and looking at beautiful fields and mountains for a while, then you end up in a fur-lined stream with lots of beautiful boulders, and it's just the variety is one of the really, really nice things about it to me. And the Northern Forest Canoe Trail is stewarded by a nonprofit organization of the same name that's headquartered in Vermont, and you can join for $35 a year, and they provide, I actually brought, a lot of times I bring all the maps for people to look at, but I have one here. So this is what they look like. These maps are just $10, and in a little while we'll kind of go through where the trail goes. So for instance, in Maine it crosses Moosehead. If you paddle up in Moosehead all the time, you might want to invest $10 and get this map. It shows you all the camping and portages and things, but it also has a lot of historical tidbits and information about the wildlife and all that sort of thing. All right, so I actually paddled the trail, the main portion of it, for the first time in 2011, and I know that some of the people in this room were really instrumental in helping that happen. I called that trip Paddle for Hope. Deb Walder did a fundraiser with Mary Kay to help raise money for that trip, and Quinn did a concert for us, and Mal did some of the publicity, and I know I'm forgetting people. Bill Bausch helped me get the word out around here, but that was a trip that I did to raise money for the Maine Children's Cancer Program. So I had already gone across Maine, which is the easier portion of the trail. But on that trip I used a native watercraft hybrid kayak that weighed 48 pounds without its seat. And it was very, very difficult for me to be able to carry the boat. And for doing the entire trail, I was going to need to be able to carry my boat. I'm going to have to go away from the light for a second because I just want to show you this. So obviously, if you're going to do a through paddle, you have to go all the way in one direction. Everybody that's through paddled so far has started in the west and gone to the east. And when you go that direction, whichever direction you go, you're going to end up going upstream for a significant portion of what you're paddling. Going west to east, it's 150 miles of upstream paddling, and it's 125 miles of portaging. So I was going to need a lighter boat and a set of wheels, both of which you'll see in a minute. So I really liked my kayak as far as how long it was and how wide it was, how stable, how much gear it could carry. So I set out to look for a canoe that was very similar in dimensions to what I was used to paddling. And Maine Sport up in Rockland was nice enough to let me test drive the boat that I ended up buying. So this is a Winona Fusion. It's made out of Kevlar, the same thing that's in bulletproof vests, and it's very lightweight. It's 13 feet long and weighs only 32 pounds. So on the first trip, whenever I had to do a portage where you couldn't use the wheels, when you had to carry everything, you'd have to make multiple trips, or at least I did. So when I had the kayak, it meant 3 trips for each carry. And my goal for this second trip was to get everything down to the size and weight where I could carry it in 2 trips. And I was successful doing that. So the boat would have my paddles, and that green seat comes with it. And then my dad built a portage yoke for me to clip into it, which would rest on my shoulders. So those things and the boat were 38 pounds, and then the rest of the gear went in the second trip. So I tried to think about what I wanted to say as far as what I hope to get out of the journey. Kind of why I did it was I like to go out and do these solo trips, but what in particular was what was I looking for when I set out on this one. And so I settled on these three things. First of all, I wanted to enjoy the journey, so I wasn't going to try to go as quickly as I could. I wanted to make sure that there would be time in my schedule to stop if I saw a moose and I wanted to sit there for an hour and a half watching it. I would, and I would say pretty successfully that ended up happening. Secondly, I wanted to write, and I used journals like that one in the upper right there. It's a waterproof journal. You write with a pencil, and it's pretty forgiving of being out there in the weather. And I filled up 2 of those with my little, I can print really teeny tiny, so I put like two rows to a line. So I actually had really good notes. And when it came time to do the writing, that was so valuable because it helped to trigger my memories. And if I go on to do another trip and write another book, which I would like to do, what was really helpful was to try to record the conversations I had with people so that later on I could, be accurate in what we might have talked about. The last thing to earn 2 asterisks is basically how the Northern Forest Canoe Trail organization recognizes people that paddle the trail without any assistance. So while you're paddling, you have to keep a log, and you record all your portages, everywhere you camped each night, and when you're finished, you send it in, and the following November, the board of directors meets and reviews it, and if they decide that you did indeed make the journey without any assistance, then you get 2 little asterisks by your name. And I really wanted that. I mean, when I left on the trip, I knew that it's what I've been calling in some of my press releases an improbable dream. I didn't really have whitewater experience. I wasn't sure that my body or my boat would make it all the way through without disaster, but I did know that I wasn't going to give up. That if I could keep going, even if I was only going to get 4 or 5 miles in a day, that I was going to go ahead and go for it. So we're going to take a look at the trail. Parts of it are very well known. In the Adirondacks, the first 90 miles follows the route of the 90-miler Canoe Classic, which people from that area might be familiar with. So in the Adirondacks, it would be the Racket and the Saranac Rivers, and then that takes you into Lake Champlain. And then in Maine, a couple of the spots that would be very well known to you would be Moosehead and the West Branch of the Penobscot and the Allagash. But then there's other remote places that probably no one really ever goes. Northern Forest Canoe Trail, through paddlers, maybe some fly fishermen in the spring. But to me, that's one of the neatest. People ask me what is my favorite part of the trail, and it's like having a favorite child. It's really hard to have one spot, but I would say that in general, being able to have the opportunity or the honor to go to places that very few people go is really cool. So the top left is a picture of one of my stealth campsites, and I ended up doing this on 5 nights, I think, out of my 38 nights of camping. And that would be when you find yourself somewhere where there is no official camping, and you just have to find a spot. I usually try to be back in the woods where I'm out of sight from the water and from any roads, and that was my favorite spot. I was on the upper Ahamusick River in New Hampshire, and it was just this really muddy section of river where the banks were filled with weeds. There was really basically nowhere you would want to camp. And all of a sudden on the left there was this high bluff that just kind of appeared, very unique micro site for that particular river. And I climbed up there and it was all open, and there was like a rusted fence and some sagging posts, so it must have been somebody's house or at least a pasture or whatever. It was a beautiful campsite. And then this is my boat right after having ascended the rapids in Spencer Stream and Little Spencer Stream, which is just below Jackman in Maine. And that's the only upstream section in the state of Maine. So when I went the first time on that first trip, this would have been the only part where I would have had to go upstream. But I injured my back, so I ended up skipping that part. So when I came along in 2015, it was especially meaningful to me to be able to get this part that I hadn't done before. And you are hearing me read from my book in public right now for the very first time. So this is what I wrote about being on Little Spencer Stream. There was no denying, though, the beauty and the spirit of this wild place. Here was more water that must be earned. Cedar and spruce clung to rocky slopes, and an intense aroma of fir infused the damp air. By now, all that was left of my packed lunch was one of Sarah's no-bake chocolate peanut butter and oatmeal cookies. I stopped to eat it beneath a brownish-gray wall of rock covered with ferns and lichens. Lost in thought, I struggled for words to capture the essence of what I was feeling. Oops. Then a sound, a soft squeal pulled me back. I looked up and into the eyes of a moose. It was fitting somehow that the first moose of my journey would find me here, on this isolated wild stream that had for so long been an enigma. She was comfortably on the other shore, peeking out from some bushes. First she sniffed, then turned her head this way and that, trying to puzzle me out. She settled and stayed. I stayed too, hardly breathing as I nibbled my cookie. At last I told her softly, speaking the words out loud, "I won't hurt you. I'm going to go and leave this place to you." But when I moved, she faded away into the brush, a spirit animal. So obviously that little stretch of water is very, very special to me. So just a quick, oops.
Wait, let us see.
Wait, what happened? Did I not have the moose up here when I was supposed to? No, I'm sorry. I'm still getting used to this because it shows me the current slide and the next one. Anyway, there it is. I ended up seeing 14 moose. I thought I was going to be only 13. I was going to end up with lucky 13. And then when I was just like in the last spot where you might possibly see one after I'd already left the Allagash and was just beyond the border of it, I saw number 14. So this is a look at the different types of water and land that I had to traverse. So first of all, there were lakes and ponds. And this is Lake Champlain, which is by far the biggest lake. And bottom right is Peter in his homemade wooden canoe, and Dan paddling a sea kayak because he was getting ready to go off to Alaska on an adventure. So they went with me across the lake, and I actually had the most trouble on Lake Champlain in the 3 miles or so that I had to paddle in order to meet them. And then once we got together and went around Cumberland Head, which is where that little lighthouse is, the wind was behind us, and we did have a lot of really drenching rain, but the wind just pushed us up. We spent one night on the lake, but altogether I was only on Lake Champlain for 28 hours, and some paddlers have ended up being windbound there for days. So Flagstaff Lake is another place in Maine that the Northern Forest Canoe Trail crosses. And those two women turned out to be a big part of my story. That's Margie and Sydney Avison, mother and daughter. And Sydney was trying to thru-paddle the trail as part of her actual master's degree in something called expeditionary studies. So she's working on a degree to do things like this for a career. Downstream rivers were a delight. So just to reel them off, for those of you that might know the different areas, I already mentioned the Racket and the Saranac in New York. Then you have the Nulhegan, and Nulhegan is in Vermont. The Connecticut is between the Vermont and New Hampshire border, and it comes at a really good time. You get to just fly down that for 20 miles, and you get a day of going fast after you've been trudging upstream and going through little winding brooks for days and days. And then New Hampshire's all upstream, and then in Maine, the 4 main rivers are the Dead River, the Moose River, the West Branch of the Penobscot, and then the Allagash St. John. And I didn't paddle any rapids over class 2. If anything was higher than that, I portaged around. And if I was going upstream, I couldn't go upstream through class 2s. I did go upstream through some class 1s. So this just shows you, like, you hear the word upstream river, or 2 words, upstream river, and it can just be so variable. On the left is you're just coming in from Lake Champlain. That was like the first paddle strokes of going upstream in the National Wildlife Refuge there. To be successful there, you just have to stay close to the banks and stay on the inside of the curves. And then the same river can transform into something like you see on the right, and it's a real struggle. The portaging, most of it I could use my kayak cart, and that's my dad in the Adirondacks. And a lot of people pull their boat, but we found that it's actually just as easy to push the boat. If you get it balanced just right, that portaging is just as easy as walking. I call it like sort of a stroll in the park, as long as you're on either a paved road or a pretty flat logging road. Are you guys leaving?
We have to go somewhere.
Oh, boy. Thanks for coming. And that's what it looked like doing the traditional portages, which I had about a total of 10 miles, but it seems like I had 100 somehow. And this one, you couldn't really tell the tale of the Northern Forest Canoe Trail without mentioning Mud Pond Carry. This is the historic traditional route into the Allagash that's been used for thousands of years. And if you read Thoreau's book, The Maine Woods, you'll discover that it was very wet then. I don't know if it's always been wet, but as the years have gone by and the feet of all the people that have crossed this way and the animals that were used for a while to actually haul gear for people, they've just worn this down into like a stream, that some of the better parts are like bottom left, where you can still see some remnants of corduroy road that were there. And the worst of it is really deep. So you might be walking up through there. It's 1.8 miles long. You might be walking through there carrying your boat, and one foot lands on a slippery rock, and then your other foot you put down and it sinks like 10 inches under the mud. It's just the most treacherous thing that you could imagine. So there were challenges, and one of the big ones were the escaped convicts. I know a lot of you looked at the blog, so you know all about this, but for those of you that might be new to my story, if you remember, there were 2 gentlemen that did sort of a Shawshank Redemption kind of escape from a prison in New York 2 weeks before we were going to leave on the trip, and they were still on the loose when we started, and I had Dad with me for the first week. One of them was still on the loose when Dad left me and went home. So that was the scariest part of the trip, and I don't know that I really was very smart to continue to paddle, but I did. And it was funny too how many of the really big challenges weren't the things that you would expect. You know, that it wasn't the rapids or really shallow stretches, but it was things like the convicts or a paving project that just totally made it impossible for you to portage down a road that you've been planning on using, that kind of thing. But there were lots and lots of delights. This family of mergansers, anybody want to guess how many babies? Just shout it out. How many do you think? 30 is pretty close. Any other guesses?
44.
34. Wow. Evidently, if a mother is killed, then they will adopt additional babies. And that's one of my favorite pictures of the trip. So there were as many wonderful memories as there are babies in this picture. And I promised myself to be done by 3, and I want to do some questions. So I think I'm just going to show you. These are mostly self-explanatory. Grand Falls is the highest waterfall of the trail at 40 feet, and that's below Jackman. And right near there is the Maine Hudson Trails hut where I stayed, and that's right where you start into the stretch where I saw that moose. Flowers, and I love learning new ones. The top left is the Allegheny monkey flower. Bottom left is swamp candle. Those were 2 that were new to me on this trip. Every single one of the trail angels, and I don't know if you would recognize anybody that's here in this room, but if you look around you just might. There's Paul Hartman, and I know Jamie's here because I saw her. Raise your hand, Jamie. Where are you? Right there. They have a cottage on Mooselook-Maguntic Lake where I stayed during both of the trips. And is Mary Berger here? She's coming. Mary's hurry. Well, da-da-da-da, she's going to come through. She took me. Bill's a trail angel too. But anyway, Mary picked me up in Stratton and took me to Sugarloaf for the night. And so we had a night of hot tubs and bathrooms and ribs, and it was pretty amazing. And it happened to be the bus drivers convention, and all our bus drivers from GSB were there. They have one sentence in the book, and every single one of them has bought upwards, so that's pretty amazing. And that's Aunt Sue on the bottom. She is here helping with the selling. Where is Aunt Sue? Right there in the back. She paddled the same section of Moosehead Lake, all of it, that the trail crosses from Rockwood to Northeast Carrier with me on both trips. And you get to paddle into Quebec and back. Going out, you go through a regular border crossing station, but coming back, you paddle down Lake Memphremagog, which straddles the border of Quebec and Vermont, and you end up at the marina in Newport, Vermont, and you check in on that video phone that's on the left in that picture. You just show them your passport and you answer their questions, and if they're happy with you, you get to come back to the United States.
There she is!
I give you Mary Berger of Quebec. And Quebec was beautiful, and this Missisquoi River is one of the rivers where you can't drink the water, which is like the kind of good thing you get by buying Katina's book. You find out that information. But there also weren't even people using it very much in Vermont. But once I crossed that border into Quebec, there were people out everywhere enjoying the river, and just some of the most beautiful, tidy farmland that you could ever imagine. The Clyde River in Vermont, so this would be right after you check back into America, and you go up the Clyde River about 20 miles or so, and its source is Island Pond, and it comes out underneath this hotel, so you paddle under the hotel to get up into Island Pond. Speaks for itself. There's moose number 14. And then it was time for the last portage. That's my boat waiting to take its last portage. And in a way, I was ready to come home and see my family, but I really, really didn't want it to end. I'm sure I'm going to go again sometime. The trip took 53 days. I was 53 years old. So it was 740 miles, 57 lakes and ponds, 21 rivers and streams, 150 miles upstream, I told you already. And it was just the adventure, really the adventure of a lifetime. And I was so cold, I have to put this ending picture. I couldn't put the one of me right standing at the kiosk like that because I just looked like I'm in agony. I was so cold and shaky because Dad and I were going to do the 30 miles or so on the St. John in 2 days because he had come to finish the trail with me. And it was just so miserable. We didn't really want to camp. We said we're going to try and do it in 1 day, and we did. So now that I'm home, one of the things I'm trying to do is to give back. And I really want to try to be an ambassador for the trail. And I think that I really had hoped to go on a work trip this past summer and help build some steps or fix a campsite or something, but instead it seems like my ambassadorship right now is to put my book out there. And I really believe that the Northern Forest Canoe Trail is going to become much more popular as people continue to discover it. Doing a through paddle in some ways is more complicated than a through hike, but it also in a lot of ways is easier for somebody who's 53 years old, and I think it's very interesting. And I've been volunteering with PWA. I don't really have any time to talk about it, but the kind of thing I'm going to do when I go around speaking is to talk about environmental issues like the Clean, Drain, Dry program, which NFCT is really promoting. They're building stations where you can wash and dry your boat when you cross, like from leaving Champlain, Lake Champlain and going into the Missisquoi River. There's a station like that. So there's just so many ways we can give back. One of which is to just try to continue to be a lifelong learner, to learn about the issues that are facing us environmentally. Every time you go out, try to learn some new plants and animals. And just, I guess, get involved in some piece of it. And then, of course, you know, a lot of the people in this room are paddlers, but some of you have other dreams. So what I'd like to leave you with is just the idea that whatever your dream is, even if it's far different from mine, go out there and follow it. Give it a chance. I mean, I would have put my chances, I don't know where I would have put them, but I wasn't sure that I was going to be able to paddle the trail. I wasn't sure I was going to finish the book. I'm pretty good at starting books. This is the 4th one. And then once it was finished and I faced the months of editing and design and all that sort of thing, I wasn't sure I was going to survive that, but I did. So, thank you very much for letting me share my adventure. I'm going to go ahead and take questions for 5 minutes or so, and then if anybody has further ones, we can talk afterward. Yes?
A few questions about your canoe and your baggage. Wasn't it because it was so light, a little tippy?
It felt like that to me at first, but I quickly felt comfortable in it, and actually, I think because of the width of it compared to its length, and the amount of rocker and tumble home and all those kind of things that I don't understand very well. Tumble home I know is like when it comes up like this. And when I have these poor answers to questions like this, I'm going to use this to show that I was just an ordinary person without a lot of experience. I went out and did this. But the boat worked well for me, and I didn't really find it tippy, and I didn't dump it one time on the long trip, the second trip, which is like a miracle, I think.
And your portaging was the second trip that you made. Did you put all your baggage into one something?
I had a big backpack dry bag which had the tent, the sleeping bag, sleeping pad, one set of dry clothes that I religiously kept in a Ziploc bag, my Tevas, and I feel like I'm forgetting one thing. So that was like a lot of the gear. The wheels I had to actually carry in my arms. They kind of fold up into like about this size. They weigh 8 pounds. And then the rest of the dry bags, probably about 4, usually, could just be clipped on different places. So it was easily, well, pretty easily done in 2 trips.
And it stayed dry mostly.
Everything stayed dry, yeah. Lisa?
Did you get blisters? Did you wear gloves? I noticed in some of the pictures you didn't have gloves on.
I didn't wear gloves. Did I remember to say that I paddled with a double-bladed paddle, like you do when you're kayaking?
Yeah.
And I had what they call yak grips, so it's sort of like a foam sleeve that you put on to the handle of the paddle. I don't like gloves. They get saturated really quickly, and I just don't like the feel on my hands. I got calluses, but I didn't get blisters. Where I got blisters really badly if you're going to go out and try this, my first trip was the Moose River Bow Loop, and I got blisters on my feet because I didn't think about wearing socks underneath my water shoes, and they were really, really bad. And of course, by this trip, I knew better than to do that, so I always wore socks. Judy?
Feel free to say if this is not the right time and place, but I'd be curious to know about the intersection between your faith journey and your water journey.
That's a great question. And it's one I really wrestled with because I wanted a book that would go out there to people of all different sort of faith beliefs, or the large group of people that's out there that find their spirituality in nature. So I wrestled with how much of it to put into the book. But I really couldn't tell my story without sharing what my faith means to me. And Ken and Kathy took me out to dinner like halfway through Maine. And Kathy said to me, "How have you changed? What have you learned?" And I realized that I just didn't really have a good answer to that question. So I knew that the last part of the trip was going to be the most relaxed with the most time for reflection. And I really did a lot of thinking. And I don't think that my faith really changed, but I think what I realized was that for me, my Christian faith is more of a here and now thing than it is something that I do for the promise of eternal life someday. It's not that I don't believe that something wonderful is out there, but I was just able to coalesce my thoughts to realize that my faith is something that I put into action every day just to get me through the day, to try to have me have a positive attitude. Does that answer your question?
Thank you very much.
Jamie?
I think reading the book, in terms of inspirational things, I was very aware of your trust in God.
Yes, I did trust God, and it was something that was rewarded. And not just trusting God, but the trust in people. That's like a huge message in the book, how wonderful, universally kind that the people were that I met. And sometimes the people in the most unexpected places, or that didn't necessarily look like somebody that would be really interested in my journey, were the ones that helped the most and that were the most giving.
What did you eat?
Well, first of all, if I was going to do it again, I did discover a really good company. They're called Good to Go Food, and they make the meals in Kittery, Maine. So if I had a good budget and I went again, I would buy some of their meals. So I ate a few of those at the end. But mostly I did things that you can get in the grocery store. So I bought a huge bag of dehydrated refried beans, and my bread was tortillas. And so I had like Mexican type wraps, and then I also had pepperoni and cheese wraps and peanut butter and jelly wraps. Breakfast was oatmeal or homemade granola or trail bars. I used, if I wasn't having to carry it a lot, I used pouches of tuna and pouches of pre-cooked chicken for protein. I ate a lot of nuts. I have out in the refreshments there is my trail mix that I took on the trip. I like cranberries, pineapple, cashews, almonds, and M&Ms. So you can all try that. And then the first 2/3 of the trail until you get to Jackman, Maine, there's ample opportunities to stop and buy fresh produce. So I would buy apples and peppers and avocados, that sort of thing. And I would eat restaurant meals when I could. Yes.
Okay, did you use a tracker, something like an inReach or something, and so that you could plot into people follow
I
you?
did. I had a Spot satellite transponder, but if I was going to do it over again, I would get a DeLorme inReach. We already were kind of invested in the Spot system, so I could send a 911 message, which I never had to do, and I could send okay messages to a preset group of people on an email list, like Bill Bausch, who was tracking my progress and recording all the GPS points. So every time anybody would receive one of those messages, they'd have my coordinates, and they'd click on it, and you could see where I was on Google Maps. And then in between the two trips, I got an upgraded model, and it actually showed every 10 minutes my little dot progressing. And some of these people, like Dan Brown, the guy on Lake Champlain in the sea kayak, he must have been obsessive, because like the one time that I got lost in Union Falls, like within half a mile, he was calling me up, "You're going the wrong way." But I would never go without something like that.
Yeah,
But the InReach
neither would I.
lets you do text messages. Do you have one?
Yes, and I think it's really, it's a great thing. And I track every place that I go and stuff, and it's useful to talk to people too.
Yep.
And people follow you and stuff.
Cool.
Yeah.
One more question, and then the rest will have to wait till we're chatting. Anybody have one last one? Carol?
What are you considering for the next great adventure?
I'm really intrigued by the new national monument in Maine, and wondering if there's some way I could go up to that area and somehow next summer coordinate some adventuring in that area that I could turn into a book, along with being able to come and go to things like the Rangeley Logging Festival, the Booth Bay Railroad Book Fair, and things like that I really want to do. The summer is going to be a really good time to spread the word about this particular book, because that's when all the adventure type people will be here. So thanks for being my first audience that I talked to about writing in addition to the trail. I've done a lot of trail talks before. You were great.
Thank you.